We are back to this penultimate session of Hilchot Purim. Again, if anybody has any questions that we haven't covered, please send them to me. Thanks to all those who've already sent in questions. Today we're talking about the Megilla, the central mitzvah of Purim night and Purim days. It's an interesting discussion. We know that we have a mitzvah to read the Megillah both at night and during the day. One of the questions was the Rishonim discuss, interesting question, is which is the main reading? Obviously, you have to hear both, right? And under normal circumstances, you would have to hear both. But let's say, for example, I'll just get, where this might be relevant. Let's say, a person has an option only to go, we'll talk soon about hearing via Zoom. Let's say a person only has an option to go to one, or only feels comfortable, for whatever reason, a person can only go to one live Megillah reading and they're going to hear one at home. Which one should they pick? Should they pick the one at night or should they pick the one in the morning? So that question would be whichever one is safer. But so the Rishonim discuss, there might be extenuating circumstances. A person's only able to hear the Megillah once. Is the night reading more important or is the daytime reading more important? So Tosfot discussed this question. They actually say that the main reading of the Megillah is during the day. Let's talk about the fact that during the day you have more Pirsum Hanes. The point of the Megillah is to publicize the miracle, we want to share it as widely as possible. Tosfot would say that during the day more people come to shul and therefore there's more Pirsum Hanes. Interesting that for over 1,000 years it's been that's been the fact that people come to shul more in daytime than at nighttime. That may be because going back a long time ago it was more dangerous to leave your house at night, and different find that reflected in various sources. But in any event, Tosfot would say, we have to read it at night, but the main reading is during the day. And again, I think we mentioned last time, but from a hashkafic point, that might be, aside from Pirsum Hanes, this idea that you've read the Megillah already, you've heard the story from beginning to end, now you go back and read it again from the beginning with the, and we can appreciate so much more Hashem's involvement in this whole story, which took place over 13 years. In any event, that's one opinion, that during the day is the main reading. There is another opinion in Rishonim, actually, the Rokeach brings this. He says the nighttime reading is the main one, and the daytime reading is sort of secondary. And based on that, but most poskim say it's actually the daytime reading which would be primary. We find a similar discussion, by the way, when it comes to shofar. When we blow the shofar, we have two sets. Now we have even more, but we have two main sets of shofar blasts. One before Musaf, one during the repetition of Musaf, which is the main one which comes first, one which comes second. A big discussion over there, we won't get into it now. So if a person had, let's say there was a situation, a person could only hear one Megillah reading, which one should they hear? So you might think that since Tosfot said the main reading is during the day, they should hear the one during the day. But actually, Halacha L'Maaseh comes out that you should hear the one at night first, because we have a principle, Ein Ma'avirin Ala Mitzvot. Once you have the opportunity to do a mitzvah, so you take it. You never know what's going to happen the next day. You never know what the situation is going to be. So you would hear at night. But again, under normal circumstances and all other things being equal, a person needs to hear both at night and during the day. Who needs to hear the Megillah? As we know, men and women are both obligated in hearing the Megillah, even though this is a positive time-bound mitzvah. It's a rabbinic mitzvah, but it's a positive time-bound mitzvah. And generally speaking, women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvot. Nonetheless, there are certain exceptions. Megillah is one of them. The reason is the principle, the Gemara tells us, Afhen hayu b'oto hanes, meaning that they were also part of that miracle. What does it mean? Afhen hayu b'oto hanes either means that women were a very significant part of creating this miracle. We know the role that was played by Queen Esther. That's one understanding. Another understanding is Afhen hayu b'oto hanes, meaning the threat of destruction was equally against men, women, and children, and therefore they were saved. Women were saved as well, just as the men were, and therefore they were part of the miraculous salvation. So whichever way we understand it, and therefore women are equally obligated in hearing the mitzvah of Megillah. That's why according to everybody from a halachic, the strict halachic perspective, that a woman could read the Megillah for another woman. As we all know, that would be. What about, and this is the question which has come to mind for many people this year, what about hearing the Megillah over a microphone, or hearing it over Zoom, or hearing it over the phone, or something like that? Believe it or not, actually, many people think that all these things are the same. Microphone, phone, telephone, Zoom may not all have the same status, but even then, let's go back. Let's take it. Let's start a little bit before that. Everybody will agree that hearing the Megillah live in person from a live Megillah reading is the best. Again, as I said, all other things being equal. that is considered hearing when you hear somebody reading it out. What happens in a situation where that is possibly not possible, or maybe dangerous, or people are concerned, or things like that? So we have a Gemara in Masechet Sukkah which tells us about the Great Shul in Alexandria. And the Great Shul in Alexandria was huge. It had thousands of people that would be there, and they held up flags. The Chazan would hold up flags during Chazarat Hashatz when it was time to answer Amen. And there were so many people that they couldn't hear the brachot, but they were far enough away and they could simply see the flags. They would know that it was time to answer Amen. That's what the Gemara says. And based on this Gemara, the Rishonim, the Achronim discuss, could there be a situation where a person can't actually hear a bracha, but nonetheless they could fulfill their obligation? They're not hearing just because they know that it's there. So in the case over there again, the case was they were davening, was Chazarat Hashatz, the Chazan's repetition. They would, person needs to answer Amen. They couldn't hear the bracha, but they could see the flags, and therefore they would know that it was time. They would know that it was time to answer Amen. Could we extrapolate from that and say, therefore, if a person can't actually hear, first of all, the post can discuss as follows. Before we get back to Purim and Megilla, you're sitting over Zoom, right? Let's say your friend, sitting, let's say somebody here in this shir right now picks up a cup of coffee, picks it up, it says a bracha, shakol niyabid varok. And the rest of us then answer Amen to that bracha. So, based on this Gemara, the answer would seem to be yes. It seems to be that you're hearing the bracha, even though you didn't hear it necessarily directly, but you know that it took place, you could answer Amen. And the truth is that many poskim, I would say probably most poskim today would say that you could hear a bracha, you could answer Amen to a bracha that you heard over Zoom. However, what's the difference between that and our case? Is that there, we're not talking about when you are fulfilling any mitzvah. All you're doing is answering Amen somebody else's bracha, but you don't necessarily have an obligation. You aren't fulfilling your obligation, certainly not to hear something. That's the first reason to say that it may actually be a little bit more complicated. The second reason to say that it may be a bit more complicated, again, the Gemara Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says as follows. He says over there, what was the case again in Alexandria? The case was everybody was standing in one place. Everybody's in the shul. It was very big, but therefore they could see the Chazan. They knew from direct sight, not through any other medium, not through any technological medium. They knew when the bracha was being said, even though they couldn't hear it. And they were all there together. They were all part of the minyan. But maybe if a person is really, really far away and is just listening over the phone or watching over the computer, there we would add that to the fact that they can't actually hear directly, and that may be another reason to say actually maybe even Amen they can't answer. And Rav Shlomo Zalman is not sure about this point. He raises those two objections, and therefore there might be room to differentiate. So when it comes to hearing the Megillah, now as I say, it gets one step more complicated, because you're hearing the Megillah, you are fulfilling your own mitzvah, and you need to actually hear it. You need to hear the Megillah that's being read. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was of the opinion that this would not suffice. And what he basically says is that you have to hear the person reading the Megillah. You have to hear not a digital reproduction of the sound of the voice that is being transmitted. And essentially, what he says is based on a scientific understanding. He doesn't talk about Zoom, because he talks about through a microphone. He talks about through a telephone as well. Would be the same. That essentially the sound has been deconstructed, it has then been reconstructed by technological means, and therefore he says that would not suffice. That was Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. There are other poskim who disagreed. The Chazon Ish, the Tzitz Eliezer in certain places, and Rav Moshe Feinstein as well. Those are the three famous opinions in terms of this. Again, each of them, you have to understand, was talking about a specific situation. Each of them was giving the psak according to the question they were asked at the time, and there may have been other mitigating factors. But what they said is that at the very least, you cannot rule it out. At the very least, you cannot say that hearing via microphone is not the same. Rav Moshe Feinstein makes the argument. He says at the end of the day, when you hear, even when I'm standing next to you and I hear what you say, what's going on? That's the way the human ear is reconstructing that sound through the airwaves, whatever it is. Again, how technical we need to get is the point of dispute. But he says, who's to say that no ordinary hearing, whether I hear from a computer, I hear from a microphone, I hear from your ear, who's to say that is different? And that was the argument Rav Moshe Feinstein made. Rav Ovadia Yosef, by the way, says something very interesting as well. He says if you just heard from a microphone, you would not have fulfilled the mitzvah. But if you were standing in a shul, and let's say that you would have been able to hear without the microphone, and therefore the microphone is used just to amplify, just to make it easier for people. Since you could have heard without it, that's similar to the case with the flags, and therefore even with the microphone, you would still have fulfilled the mitzvah. And there are, I saw it written that in Rav Vadia's shul, they used to read Megillah with a microphone every year, again, based on this idea and based on this psak. So bring all of that together. What we're left with is as follows. The majority opinion is that, well, the consensus is that if you're able to hear the Megillah in person, that is best, and one should suffice with that. And there are quite a number of authorities who say that hearing it via digital means would not suffice. That is not real hearing, everyone defined, and that would not be okay to fulfill the mitzvah. There is a significant minority of poskim who say that actually hearing via digital means is good enough, or may be good enough, or at the very least we cannot rule it out. And therefore, putting all of that together, what are we left with in our current situation? What we're left with is as follows. If a person's able to hear the Megillah in a safe way, in a safe environment, where there is social distancing and there aren't so many people, and it's all done according to the rules, and a person has no reason not to go to that because they are healthy and they don't have underlying health conditions, they aren't currently having any symptoms, they're leaving their house anyway for all sorts of things like shopping and going to the park and all other sorts of social interactions, and that are no less dangerous, then they should go and they should find a place where they can hear the Megillah. If a person's unable to do that because a person's not leaving the house at all, or a person has underlying health conditions, or is unable to be in a place where there's a safe environment. So if they have a Megillah, their own kosher scroll at home, they should read from that. If they can't do that, so then they could rely on this. Idea of hearing via the telephone. Again, hearing via the telephone would actually be preferable because it's much more direct. Over Zoom, we know that sometimes there's a little bit of a delay, sometimes it cuts out or freezes, and that would be a problem. That's why if somebody is relying on this, I'll just add as well, if somebody has COVID or somebody has to be in isolation, then of course they should be relying on this because there's nothing else they can do. But if one is doing that, then they should have the Megillah in front of them from a chumash where they can read along with the words. You have to read from a kosher scroll. That halacha applies only to the majority of the Megillah. But if a minority of persons is actually allowed to read Baal Peh, or allowed to read from a printed form. Therefore, if you're listening over Zoom and you have a chumash in front of you, so it freezes, it cuts out, you miss a few words, you could fill in those words and that would be okay. Additionally, and with this I'll end, some of the poskim write that even according to those opinions that say that you wouldn't fulfill the mitzvah, and let's say a person's in a situation whereby, like I said, somebody's in isolation, and they can't leave the house, they don't have a Megillah, they don't know how to read, and they should certainly hear it over Zoom, and they should hear whatever it is. The Shulchan Aruch actually writes that somebody who's in a place where there's no Megillah should read the Megillah from a chumash. The reason is we don't want to forget about, we don't want to forget about the story of Purim. We don't want to. There is a value, even if a person is anus, and even if a person is not able to fulfill the mitzvah as it is in the proper way, there's still a value in having that experience and reading through that story and taking part in what Chazal established for us as the Pirsum Hanes of Purim Day. Okay, Ad Kan. Tomorrow, 12:30, same time, same place.